May 8th, 1945. The war in Europe is over, but in Berlin there is no celebration. 15 million German women stand in the ruins of a civilization that has collapsed so completely, so utterly, that the word apocalypse seems inadequate. This is not a story about politics. This is not a story about ideology. This is a story about what happens to human beings when everything, and I mean everything, is taken away. Now, let me guess what you're thinking right now. German women after World War II. You probably have an image in your mind. Maybe it's from a textbook, maybe it's from a movie. Black and white photographs of rubble, women in headscarves, something about the Marshall Plan, American GIs handing out chocolate democracy restored, credits roll. That's the sanitized version, the version that fits neatly into a narrative where good triumphs over evil, where justice is served, where the bad guys lose and everyone else moves on. But history isn't a movie. And what actually happened to 15 million German women in the aftermath of total war is a story far more complex, far more disturbing, and far more human than any Hollywood ending could capture. What you think you know about these women, you're probably wrong. What history taught you, incomplete at best. What really happened in the months and years after May 1945 is a story that was buried, suppressed, and silenced for over 60 years. Let me start by destroying your first assumption. When the war ended, these women didn't just move on, they couldn't. Because the war didn't actually end on May 8th, 1945. Not for them. For German women, May 8th was when a different kind of war began. Here's a number they don't put in textbooks. 2 million. 2 million German women were raped in the aftermath of World War II. 2 million, that's a conservative estimate. Some historians believe the real number is closer to 3 million. In Berlin alone, 95,000 women were raped in the spring of 1945. In some districts, every single woman between the ages of 13 and 70 was assaulted, not most. All. I need you to sit with that for a moment, because this isn't abstract history. These weren't statistics, these were human beings, grandmothers, mothers, teenagers, children. And for 60 years, almost no one talked about it. Why? Because the story didn't fit. The story we wanted to tell about World War II was simple. Evil was defeated, justice prevailed, the good guys won. But what do you do with a story where 2 million women on the losing side experience systematic sexual violence? Where do you fit that into the narrative? You don't. So you bury it. In 1954, a German journalist named Martha Hillers published an anonymous diary titled A Woman in Berlin. She documented her experiences during the Soviet occupation of the German capital. She wrote about the sexual violence with unflinching honesty. She described the survival strategies women developed, the protector arrangements, the way women would joke grimly about their experiences because humor was the only weapon they had left. The book was met with outrage, not at what had happened to the women, at the women themselves. German critics called Hillers a traitor. They said she was besmirching the honor of German women, that she was spreading Soviet propaganda. The book was withdrawn from publication. It would remain out of print in Germany for almost 50 years. This wasn't an isolated case. Women who tried to speak about their experiences were silenced by their own families, their own communities, their own government. Nobody speaks of it became an unwritten rule. Niemand spricht darüber. Why the silence? The West German government didn't want to talk about it because acknowledging mass sexual violence by Soviet soldiers would complicate the geopolitical chess game of the Cold War. The East German government didn't want to talk about it because the Soviet Union was supposed to be the liberators, and liberators don't commit mass atrocities, and German society didn't want to talk about it because of shame, because of guilt, because how do you claim victimhood when your nation just committed the Holocaust? So 2 million women carried their trauma in silence. They married, they raised children, they rebuilt their lives, and they never, ever spoke of what happened to them in the spring and summer of 1945. Not to their husbands, not to their children, not even to each other. Until decades later, when some of them, now in their 70s and 80s, finally began to break the silence. And what they revealed was so much worse than anyone had imagined. But here's what's crucial to understand. Sexual violence was only one element of what these women faced, only one part of the story. And if we focus exclusively on that trauma, as important as it is to acknowledge, we miss the even larger, more complex reality of what life was like for German women in the aftermath of total war. Because these women weren't just victims, they were also survivors, perpetrators, resistors, collaborators, heroes, cowards, saints and sinners. They were human beings navigating an impossible situation with no good choices and no clear moral path. Let me paint you a different picture. A fuller picture. May 9th, 1945, the day after Germany's unconditional surrender. A 32-year-old woman named Elizabeth stands in what used to be her apartment in Hamburg. 3 walls are gone. The 4th is barely standing. Everything she owned has been destroyed or looted. Her husband is missing, presumed dead, on the Eastern Front. She has 3 children, ages 8, 6, and 3. She has no food, no water, no money. The electricity doesn't work because there is no electrical grid. The water doesn't work because the pipes are shattered. The government doesn't exist because there is no government. She is, for all practical purposes, living in the Stone Age, except the Stone Age probably had better infrastructure, and this is her reality. This is the reality of millions of German women in May of 1945. Not the reality you see in history books, which tend to jump from Germany surrenders to the Marshall Plan, rebuilds Europe, as if everything in between was a brief, unfortunate intermission. What happened in between was hell. You know what else you probably think you know, that the Allies swooped in immediately and saved everyone, that food aid arrived, that order was restored, that civilization quickly returned to normal. Wrong. In the British occupation zone, the official daily calorie ration for German civilians in the winter of 1945 to 46 was 1,015 calories. That's less than half of what a human being needs to survive. In reality, many people received far less, 500 calories a day, sometimes less. Do you know what happens to a human body on 500 calories a day? Starvation. Not the metaphorical kind, the literal, medical kind. Your body begins consuming itself. Muscle tissue breaks down. Cognitive function deteriorates. Your body temperature drops. You become susceptible to every disease. And if you're a nursing mother, your milk dries up. Your baby starves too. Thousands died, not in concentration camps, not in combat. They died in the peace. They died after the war was supposedly over. They died of starvation and exposure and disease in the heart of Europe in 1945 and 46. The winter of 1945 to 46 became known as the Hunger Winter. In some cities, the death rate was higher than it had been during the war. Let that sink in. More people died after the shooting stopped than during the shooting. Why? Because Germany's infrastructure had been systematically destroyed. The Allied bombing campaign had been brutally effective. Rail lines were obliterated. Roads were impassable. Bridges were rubble. The coal mines that heated homes and powered industry were in ruins. Agricultural production had collapsed. The supply chains that fed cities had disintegrated. And the Allies, quite frankly, didn't care much about keeping Germans alive. After years of Nazi atrocities, after the revelations of the death camps, there wasn't a lot of sympathy for German suffering. They started it, was the general sentiment. And that sentiment had consequences. Let me give you some more numbers, because numbers don't have politics, numbers don't have agendas, numbers just are. 400 million cubic meters of rubble. That's how much debris filled German cities in 1945. To put that in perspective, if you stacked it all up, it would create a mountain range, an entire mountain range of broken buildings, shattered lives, and pulverized civilization. 70% of housing in major German cities was destroyed. 70%. In some cities, like Dresden or Cologne, the destruction was closer to 90%. Millions of people were literally homeless. Not homeless in the sense of not having a nice place to live, homeless in the sense of sleeping in basements of destroyed buildings, in subway tunnels, in makeshift shelters that offered no protection from the elements. 7 million German men were dead, missing, or in prisoner of war camps. 7 million. That means 15 million German women were functionally on their own. No husbands, no fathers, no brothers, no adult male support structure of any kind. And these women had 65 million mouths to feed. 65 million surviving Germans, most of them children, elderly or disabled, all of them hungry, all of them cold, all of them traumatized. So here's the question that nobody wanted to ask in 1945, and that history has largely avoided asking since. What do you do when you're a woman in that situation? When civilization has collapsed, when there's no food, when your children are starving, when there are no authorities to appeal to, no safety net to catch you, no hope on the horizon, what do you do? The answer is, you do whatever it takes to survive. And whatever it takes covered a spectrum of actions from the heroic to the horrific, from the noble to the morally compromising, from the selfless to the utterly desperate. And this is not the story you know. This is not the story that gets told, because the story of German women after World War II doesn't fit neatly into categories of victim or perpetrator, good or bad, innocent or guilty. It's messy, it's complicated, it's human. And it's time someone told it. Let me introduce you to someone. Her name is Gertrude. She's 41 years old in the summer of 1945. Before the war, she was a school teacher. She taught history, ironically enough. She had a pleasant life, a comfortable apartment in Munich, a husband who worked as an engineer, 2 daughters. Now, her husband is dead, killed in Normandy. Her apartment is gone. Her daughters are alive, but barely. The older one, Anna, is 16. The younger one, Liesel, is 12. They're living in the basement of what used to be a church. 7 other families share the same space. There's no privacy, no sanitation, no heat. And Gertrude is holding a brick. This is how it started for millions of German women, with a brick. The occupation authorities issued an order. German civilians would clear the rubble by hand, without machinery, without tools beyond the most basic. Women would form human chains, passing bricks from the ruins to collection points where they could be sorted, cleaned, and eventually reused for reconstruction. The Trümmerfrauen, the rubble women, that's what they were called. Every day, Gertrude wakes before dawn. She has no breakfast because there is no breakfast. She walks 3 miles to the work site. She lines up with hundreds of other women, and for 12 hours she passes bricks from hand to hand to hand. 1 brick every few seconds, hundreds of bricks every hour, thousands every day. Her hands bleed, the bricks are sharp, jagged, they tear skin, but there are no gloves, so her hands bleed and callous and bleed again. Her back aches from the bending, the lifting, the endless repetition. By the end of the first week, she can barely move. By the end of the first month, she's lost 30 pounds. She's developing sores that won't heal because her body doesn't have the nutrients to repair tissue. But she keeps going, because if she works, she receives a ration card. And with a ration card, she can get 400 grams of bread, enough to keep her daughters alive for another day. This was the deal: work or starve. So the women worked. Historians estimate that between 1945 and 1948, German women cleared 400 million cubic meters of rubble. They did it primarily by hand. They reconstructed enough bricks to rebuild entire cities. They created pathways through the destruction so that whatever aid was coming could actually arrive. They rebuilt Germany, literally, brick by brick by brick. But here's what the photographs don't show you. Here's what the historical accounts often sanitize. The rubble wasn't just broken buildings, it was also bodies. Thousands upon thousands of bodies buried in the debris. Bodies that had been there since the bombing raids. Bodies that had been there for months in the summer heat. The women had to clear those too. Gertrude will never forget the first time she uncovered human remains, a child's arm still wearing a bracelet. She vomited, she cried, and then she kept working, because what else could she do? The body had to be removed, the rubble had to be cleared, life, such as it was, had to continue. Let me tell you what real hunger feels like, not the "I skipped lunch" kind of hunger. Not the "I'm doing intermittent fasting" kind of hunger, real hunger. The kind that rewires your brain, the kind that makes you a different person. Anna, Gertrude's 16-year-old daughter, keeps a diary. In August of 1945, she writes, "I think about food every moment of every day. When I sleep, I dream about food. When I wake, my first thought is food. I see bread in my mind. I imagine the taste of butter. I remember what apples tasted like. I can't remember what Mama's face looks like, but I can remember the taste of apples." This is what starvation does. It narrows your entire existence to a single, desperate question. Where is the next meal coming from? The official ration in Munich in the winter of 1945 is 900 calories per day. But official rations exist mostly on paper. In reality, the supply chain is so broken that distributions are irregular, unpredictable. Sometimes a week goes by without any rations arriving. Sometimes the bread is so moldy it's green. Sometimes the soup is just hot water with a few potato peels floating in it. Gertrude becomes obsessed with efficiency. How can she maximize the nutritional value of what little they have? She boils potato peels to extract every last nutrient. She makes coffee from roasted acorns. She learns which weeds are edible: dandelion greens, nettle leaves. Tree bark can be ground into a flour substitute, though it provides almost no nutrition and makes your stomach cramp. But here's the thing about starvation. It's not just physical, it's moral. Because when you're truly hungry, when your children are truly hungry, you start making calculations you never thought you'd make. A woman offers Gertrude extra bread. The catch? The bread comes from an American soldier, and the American soldier wants something in return. Not from Gertrude, from Anna, the 16-year-old. What do? This is the question that haunted millions of German women in 1945 and 46. What do you do when the choice is between your daughter's body and your daughter's life? When starvation is a certainty, but survival might come at a terrible price. Gertrude says no. She sends the woman away. But that night, lying in the dark, listening to Liesel whimper from hunger pains, she wonders if she made the right choice. She wonders how many more days they can last. She wonders if her moral principles are worth her children's lives. She's not alone in this moral agony. Across Germany, millions of women are making impossible calculations. Some say yes to the soldiers, some become prostitutes, though that word doesn't really capture the desperation of the transaction. Survival sex is probably more accurate. Food for access, cigarettes for intimacy, chocolate for the appearance of consent. The Americans called them Fräuleins, the British called them Fräuleins, the French called them Fräuleins, as if the German word made the transaction somehow more exotic, less sordid, more palatable. But these weren't Fräuleins in any romantic sense. These were starving women doing what starving people have done throughout history, selling the only thing they had left to sell. And German society judged them viciously for it. The same society that had sent their men to die in Hitler's war, the same society that had enabled the Third Reich, the same society that had no food, no shelter, and no solutions. That society looked at desperate women trading sex for bread and called them whores. Everything has a price. In 1945 Germany, the price just isn't measured in money. Money is worthless. The Reichsmark is toilet paper. Nobody wants it. Nobody accepts it. The entire economy has reverted to barter. A pound of butter, 300 cigarettes, a man's suit, 500 cigarettes, a wedding ring, maybe a sack of potatoes, maybe. Cigarettes become the de facto currency. American cigarettes especially. Lucky Strikes, Camels. A single cigarette can buy a meal. A carton can buy survival for a week. The black market runs on tobacco. Gertrude has nothing to trade. Her apartment was destroyed, remember? Everything she owned was looted or buried in rubble. She has no jewelry, no fine clothes, no family heirlooms. She has nothing, except she does have something. She has knowledge, she has skills. Before the war, she was a teacher. She speaks English, which she learned at university. And English is valuable now, very valuable. American soldiers want German souvenirs. They want Nazi flags, medals, Lugers, helmets. The black market is flooded with Wehrmacht memorabilia, most of it fake, but the Americans don't know what's real and what's fake. They need translators, intermediaries, someone who can navigate both worlds. Gertrude becomes a fixer. She doesn't think of it that way. She doesn't think of herself as a black marketeer. She's just trying to feed her daughters. But that's what she is. She brokers deals between German sellers and American buyers. She takes a cut, usually in cigarettes, sometimes in food. Once, memorably, in a can of Spam, which her daughters devour so quickly they make themselves sick. The black market is where Germany actually functions in 1945 and 46. The official economy is dead, but underground, in the shadows, in the rubble, trade continues. Women are the primary operators. They have to be. The men are gone. These women become entrepreneurs out of sheer necessity. They trade, they smuggle, they negotiate, they take risks that would have been unthinkable in their previous middle-class lives. And slowly, gradually, through thousands of tiny transactions, they begin to resurrect something resembling an economy. This is how civilization rebuilds, not through grand Marshall Plan gestures, those come later, but through desperate individuals figuring out how to survive one day at a time. Gerda is 38. Her husband, Klaus, was drafted in 1943. He was sent to the Eastern Front. The last letter she received from him was dated March 3, 1945. In it, he wrote that his unit was retreating toward Berlin, that the situation was difficult, that he loved her and their son, Peter, that he would see them soon. She never heard from him again. Now it's August of 1945. The war has been over for 3 months. Gerda checks the Red Cross lists every week. The Red Cross has set up registration centers where families can search for missing soldiers. The lists are posted on bulletin boards, thousands of names, thousands of men who are in prisoner of war camps in Russia, France, Britain, America. Klaus's name isn't on the lists. Every week, Gerda walks 6 miles to the Red Cross Center. Every week she scans the new names. Every week she walks home with a little less hope. But she can't give up hope entirely, because without hope, What does she have? Klaus might be alive. He might be in a Soviet camp somewhere in Siberia. Communications are impossible. Maybe he's trying to get word to her. Maybe he'll come home tomorrow, or next week, or next month. So she waits. 6 million German women are waiting just like Gerda. 6 million women whose husbands, fathers, brothers, sons are missing. Some will eventually get confirmation, a name on a list, a body identified. Some small measure of closure, however painful, but millions will never know. The Eastern Front consumed entire armies. Men simply vanished into the vastness of Russia and never came back. No bodies, no records, no confirmation of death, just absence. How do you grieve someone who might not be dead? How do you move on when there's no body to bury, no funeral to attend, no official recognition of loss? You don't. You exist in limbo. Neither widow nor wife. Neither grieving nor hoping. Just waiting. Always waiting. Gerda will check those Red Cross lists for the next 18 years. Klaus's name will never appear. She will never remarry. She will raise Peter alone. She will work as a seamstress, barely making enough to survive. And every few months, for nearly 2 decades, she will walk to the Red Cross Center and check the lists, just in case. This is a particular kind of torture, the torture of uncertainty. And millions of German women endured it, some for years, some for decades, some for the rest of their lives. 10-year-old Hans is teaching himself to steal. Not because he's a bad kid, because he's a hungry kid, and hungry kids steal or they die. His mother, Ilse, knows what he's doing. She pretends not to, because what can she say? Don't steal, we'll starve with dignity. That's not a real option. Dignity is a luxury they can't afford. Hans is part of a loose gang of boys who roam the ruins looking for anything valuable. They steal from Allied supply depots. They steal from other Germans. They steal from rubble piles, finding things to trade on the black market. They're not gangsters. They're children trying to survive in a world where all the adults have failed them. The thing is, Hans is one of the lucky ones. He's alive. He has a mother. He has shelter of sorts. Millions of German children have none of those things. The wolf children are the ones who haunt everyone. These are orphans, children whose entire families were killed. They live wild in the ruins. They form packs for protection. They sleep in bombed-out buildings. They eat whatever they can scavenge. Many of them are feral by any reasonable definition. They don't speak much. They don't trust adults. They exist in a permanent state of animal survival. Nobody knows how many wolf children there are. Thousands, certainly. Maybe tens of thousands. They're almost invisible to official record-keeping because they don't exist in the system. No records, no ration cards, no names sometimes. Some German women try to help. They leave out scraps of food, they offer shelter, but they can barely feed their own children. What can they do for feral orphans? This is another part of the story that doesn't get told. The children of 1945 and 46, an entire generation that grew up in apocalypse. Some of them will recover. Some of them will go on to live normal lives, but many of them will carry the trauma forever. The hunger, the fear, the abandonment, the violence they witnessed. They'll become the adults of the 1960s and 70s. They'll raise their own children, and the trauma will pass down subtly, invisibly, like a genetic code of pain. Psychological studies done in the 1990s and 2000s will show that the children and grandchildren of World War II survivors carry measurable trauma responses, anxiety, depression, difficulty with trust and attachment. The war doesn't end when the shooting stops. It echoes through generations. It's December 19th, 1945. Gertrude has managed, through weeks of black market dealings, through exhausting labor, through a combination of luck and determination, to acquire a chicken, an actual living chicken. She hides it in the church basement. She feeds it scraps. She protects it like it's made of gold, because it is made of gold. This chicken represents the possibility of eggs protein, a chance to build her daughter's strength back up. On Christmas Eve, she makes a decision. She kills the chicken, she plucks it, she cooks it over a makeshift fire in a metal drum. The smell draws other families from the basement. They stare with hollow eyes. Children cry because they're so hungry they can't help it. Gertrude does something she didn't plan to do. She shares. She divides the chicken into portions. It's not much, a few bites for each family. But for one night, on Christmas Eve, 1945, in the basement of a ruined church, 23 people have hot food, real food meat. They sing Christmas carols, voices cracking with emotion and malnutrition. They cry, they pray, they hold each other. This is not a happy ending. The chicken is gone by morning. Tomorrow they'll be hungry again. Tomorrow they'll go back to passing bricks, searching for scraps, waiting for absent husbands, trying to survive another day in hell. But for this one night, they remembered what it felt like to be human, to share, to care for others, to experience something other than desperation. These small moments of grace, they happened, not often, not reliably, but they happened, and they mattered, because they proved that even in the worst circumstances, even when civilization has collapsed, even when every incentive points toward selfishness and brutality, humans can still choose compassion. Not always. Often people chose cruelty. Often people did terrible things. We'll get to that part of the story too. But sometimes, in the darkness, there were small lights, small victories, small reminders that humanity wasn't entirely lost. Gertrude's Christmas chicken, it's not much. But in 1945, Germany, it was everything. Now we need to talk about the uncomfortable part. The part of this story that makes it impossible to see these women as simply victims, because they weren't simply victims. Some of them were perpetrators. Some of them were complicit. Some of them enabled the very regime that led to this catastrophic ending. Let me introduce you to Margaret. She's 46 years old in 1945. She worked during the war, not in a rubble gang, not in a factory doing civilian work. She worked in a munitions plant. From 1942 to 1945, Margaret assembled artillery shells. 8 hours a day, 6 days a week, she attached fuses to shells that would be fired at Allied soldiers. She did this willingly. She wasn't forced. She volunteered because the pay was better than other jobs, because she believed she was supporting her husband on the front, because she believed in Germany's victory. The shells she assembled killed people. How many? Impossible to say. But some number of British, American, Canadian, or Soviet soldiers died because of the work Margaret did with her hands. Is she a victim now in 1945 when she's starving and homeless? Or is she a perpetrator? Or is she both? Can you be both? This is the moral complexity that post-war Germany tried very hard not to think about. Because if you acknowledge that many German women actively participated in the war effort, and they did, millions of them did, then their suffering after the war becomes morally ambiguous in ways that make everyone uncomfortable. By 1944, 7 million German women were working in war industries. 7 million. They built tanks, they assembled rifles, they produced ammunition, they calibrated bomb sites, they worked in chemical plants producing explosives. This wasn't slave labor, this was voluntary work by German citizens who believed they were supporting a just cause, or who at least believed they were supporting their nation's survival. The conditions were brutal. 14-hour shifts, dangerous chemicals. Factory accidents were common. Women lost fingers in machinery. Women suffered chemical burns. Women died in Allied bombing raids on the factories where they worked. After the war, these women had a problem. Their work history made them complicit, made them participants. And as the full scope of Nazi atrocities became clear, as the death camps were liberated and the world learned what Germany had done, suddenly having worked in a munitions factory became something you didn't talk about. These women buried that part of their history. They became just housewives in their personal narratives. They didn't mention the years in the factories. They didn't mention the bombs they helped build or the weapons they helped produce. And German society let them bury it, because if you started asking questions about what civilian women did during the war, you'd have to ask questions about what civilian men did, what everyone did. And post-war Germany, both East and West, had no interest in that level of accountability. Better to focus on victimhood, better to emphasize the suffering, better to talk about the rubble women and the rape victims and the widows, better not to mention the millions of women who built Hitler's war machine, but they did build it, and that matters. Some women weren't just complicit. They were enthusiastic supporters, true believers in National Socialism. And in 1945, those women faced a reckoning. Brunhilde was a Nazi, not just a passive supporter, an active member of the NS Frauenschaft, the National Socialist Women's League. She attended rallies, she organized community support for the war effort. She reported her neighbors for defeatist talk. She believed with absolute certainty that Germany was engaged in a righteous struggle for survival. When the war ended, Brunhilde's world collapsed, not just physically, everyone's physical world collapsed, but ideologically. Everything she believed turned out to be a lie. Everything she'd worked for turned out to be evil. Everyone she'd trusted turned out to be monsters. How do you process that? How do you reconcile the fact that you gave the best years of your life to absolute evil? Some women, like Brunhilde, simply couldn't. They retreated into delusion. They convinced themselves that the reports about the death camps were exaggerated Allied propaganda, that Hitler had been betrayed by weak subordinates, that if only Germany had held out longer, victory would have come. These were the unreconstructed Nazis. They never accepted responsibility. They never acknowledged the horror. They lived the rest of their lives in a bubble of denial and resentment. Other women went through a genuine reckoning. The psychological term is cognitive dissonance, when reality contradicts your core beliefs so completely that your mind breaks trying to reconcile them. Some of these women had mental breakdowns, some committed suicide, some converted to extreme political positions in the other direction, became communists or radical pacifists. Some retreated into private life and never spoke about politics again, but all of them had to live with the knowledge that they'd been wrong. Catastrophically, historically, murderously wrong. And that knowledge was its own kind of hell. Here's the question that hung over post-war Germany. Who knew? Who knew about the death camps? Who knew about the systematic extermination of 6 million Jews? Who knew about the gas chambers, the mass shootings, the death marches? The official answer became almost no one. The camps were secret. The Holocaust was hidden from ordinary Germans. People didn't know. This is at best a massive oversimplification. At worst, it's a lie. Did everyone know every detail? No. Were ordinary German civilians forced to watch film footage of Auschwitz? No. But did people know that something terrible was happening to Jews? Yes. Absolutely yes. Jewish neighbors disappeared. Everyone saw that. Synagogues burned. Everyone saw that. Jews were forced to wear yellow stars. Everyone saw that trains packed with people rolled east. People saw those trains. Soldiers came home on leave and told stories, whispered stories about what was happening in the east, about mass shootings, about villages where every Jewish person was killed in a single day. The stories spread. People knew something. And then there's the question of willful ignorance, of choosing not to know, of seeing evidence and deciding not to look closer, of hearing rumors and deciding not to believe them because belief would require action, and action was dangerous, and it was easier, so much easier, to just not know. German women participated in this willful ignorance as much as German men. Maybe more, because women were the social fabric of communities. Women were the ones who noticed when the Jewish family next door was gone. Women were the ones who didn't ask questions. Women were the ones who took over the apartment, accepted the furniture, benefited from the absence. Not all women. Some women hid Jews, some women resisted. We'll get to them. But many women, most women, were complicit through silence, through acceptance, through choosing not to see what was happening all around them. And after the war, when the Allied forces forced German civilians to tour the concentration camps, to see the piles of bodies, to confront the reality of what had been done in their name, many women claimed shock, claimed ignorance, claimed they had no idea. Some of that shock was genuine. The full industrial scope of the Holocaust was indeed hidden from most civilians. But the broader persecution, the violence, the disappearances, those were visible, and those were ignored. Now we need to talk about the women who didn't just ignore the Holocaust, the women who participated in it. There were approximately 3,000 female SS guards in the Nazi concentration camp system. 3,000 women who volunteered to work in camps to guard prisoners, to enforce the brutal regime that worked millions of people to death. Some of these women became infamous. Irma Grese, the Beast of Belsen, Ilse Koch, the Witch of Buchenwald, Dorothea Binz, senior guard at Ravensbrück. These women weren't just following orders. They took initiative. They inflicted cruelty. Survivors testified to beatings, torture, sadistic games. Female guards who seemed to take pleasure in the suffering they caused. After the war, some of these women were tried, some were executed. Irma Grese was hanged in 1945 at age 22. Others received long prison sentences. A few escaped justice entirely, disappearing into post-war anonymity. But here's what's important. These women complicate the narrative because for decades the story of Nazi atrocities was told as a story about male violence, about SS men and Wehrmacht soldiers, about Hitler and Himmler and Goering, men doing evil, but women did evil too, not as many. The scale of female participation was much smaller, but it happened. And acknowledging it forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about gender and violence, about whether women are inherently more peaceful, more nurturing, more moral than men. The evidence from the camps suggests no. Put women in a system of absolute power over helpless victims. Some of them will become monsters, just like men. This doesn't mean we should equate the suffering of German women after the war with the crimes of female SS guards. The numbers aren't remotely comparable. 3,000 guards versus 15 million civilian women. But it does mean we can't paint all German women as victims. Some were perpetrators, and their crimes don't vanish just because they suffered later. In 1946, the Nuremberg trials began. Top Nazi leaders were prosecuted for crimes against humanity. The world watched as evidence of systematic atrocities was presented, as the architects of genocide were held accountable. But Nuremberg only prosecuted the top tier, the big names. What about everyone else? What about the millions of ordinary Germans who enabled the regime, who voted for Hitler, who joined the party, who looked the other way, who benefited from stolen Jewish property, who worked in the war industries, who cheered at rallies? The answer is almost nothing happened to them. This was called denazification. The Allies tried initially to remove Nazis from positions of power, to hold people accountable, but it quickly became impossible. Too many people were implicated. The entire society was complicit to some degree. If you fired everyone who'd been in the Nazi party, you'd have no teachers, no doctors, no administrators, no one to run the country. So compromises were made. Most people were reclassified as fellow travelers or nominal Nazis. They filled out questionnaires, they paid small fines, and then they went back to their lives. For German women, this meant that the vast majority who'd supported the regime, who'd worked in war industries, who'd participated in the Nazi social organizations, faced no consequences beyond the general suffering of defeat. This created a profound moral distortion. It allowed millions of Germans to rewrite their own histories, to claim they'd never really supported Hitler, to minimize their involvement, to focus exclusively on their own suffering while ignoring or downplaying the suffering they'd helped cause. And German women were particularly good at this rewriting, because the post-war narrative emphasized women as victims of rape, of starvation, of widowhood. It became very easy for women to adopt that identity exclusively, to forget or suppress the years when they'd sewn uniforms for the Wehrmacht, or assembled bombs, or reported neighbors to the Gestapo, or simply remained silent while Jewish families were dragged from their homes. This is the original sin of post-war Germany, not the Holocaust itself. That was the Third Reich's sin. But the failure to honestly reckon with mass complicity, the creation of a national narrative where everyone was either a resistance hero or an innocent victim, and the millions of people in between just vanished from the story. But they didn't all comply. Some women resisted, and their stories deserve to be told precisely because they prove that resistance was possible, that following orders and everyone was doing it were choices, not inevitabilities. Sophia Magdalena Scholl was 21 when she was executed by guillotine in February 1943. She was a member of the White Rose, a non-violent resistance group that distributed leaflets criticizing the Nazi regime. She knew the risks. She chose to resist anyway. Before her execution, she said, "How can we expect righteousness to prevail when there is hardly anyone willing to give himself up individually to a righteous cause?" She was one of many. Women who hid Jews in their homes, women who forged documents, women who smuggled food into ghettos, women who refused to give the Nazi salute, women who told jokes that mocked Hitler, women who committed small acts of sabotage in factories, women who simply refused to participate in the cruelty. Most of them were never famous. Most of them died unknown. Some were caught and executed. Some survived and never spoke about what they'd done because post-war Germany wasn't particularly interested in celebrating resistance. It was awkward. It implied that resistance was possible, which meant that those who didn't resist had made a choice. These women, the resistors, they're the moral counterweight. They prove that German women weren't simply passive victims of history. They had agency, they made choices. Some chose compliance or collaboration, others chose resistance. And after the war, women who'd resisted had to live alongside women who'd collaborated, had to rebuild society together, had to somehow create a functional nation despite carrying radically different moral histories. How do you do that? How do you build trust in a society where your neighbor might have been the one who reported your family to the Gestapo, where the woman serving you in the bakery might have worked as a concentration camp guard, where anyone over a certain age carries secrets they'll never reveal. You do it by agreeing not to ask too many questions, by accepting official narratives, by focusing on rebuilding rather than reckoning, by drawing a line under the past and moving forward. This worked in a practical sense. Germany was rebuilt. Democracy was established in the West. The economy recovered. Life went on. But the moral cost was enormous. Millions of people never had to answer for what they'd done, never had to honestly confront their choices, never had to seek forgiveness or offer accountability. And that unfinished moral business haunted Germany for generations. It haunts it still. Something changes in 1948. You can feel it in the historical record. The tone shifts. The worst of the crisis has passed. People aren't starving anymore, or at least not in the same numbers. The rubble is being cleared faster. Infrastructure is being rebuilt. Currency reform creates a functioning economy. The Marshall Plan money starts flowing. Hope returns. Cautiously, tentatively, but it returns. For women like Gertrude, this means change is accelerating. Her daughters are no longer on the edge of starvation. Anna, now 19, has found work as a typist with the American Occupation Authority. The pay is decent. More importantly, it's regular. For the first time since the war ended, Gertrude can plan more than one day ahead. They move out of the church basement into an actual apartment. It's small, the building is damaged, but it has walls and a roof and a door that locks. It has running water, though the plumbing is unreliable. It has electricity, though it only works a few hours a day. It feels like luxury. After 3 years in a basement, anything feels like luxury. Gertrude stops working in the rubble gangs. Her body can't take it anymore. She's 44 but feels 70. Her hands are permanently scarred, her back is ruined. But she doesn't need to pass bricks anymore. She finds work doing what she was trained to do, teaching. The schools are reopening. Education is being restored. Children who've spent years growing up feral need to be re-civilized, need to learn to read and write and think, need to be taught a version of history that doesn't glorify what their parents' generation did. This is Gertrude's second act, teaching children in the ruins, teaching them that the past was evil, teaching them that the future can be different, teaching them to be Germans without being Nazis. It's exhausting work. Many of these children are damaged, traumatized. Some have seen their parents killed. Some have killed to survive. Some don't speak for weeks at a time. Some explode in violence at the slightest provocation. But slowly, incrementally, they begin to heal. They learn, they adapt, they become children again instead of survivors. And watching this transformation, Gertrude allows herself to believe something she hasn't believed in years. That maybe the future won't just be an endless repetition of suffering, that maybe something better is possible. They'll call it the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, the astonishingly rapid recovery of West Germany from total devastation to economic powerhouse in less than a decade. The Standard story credits the Marshall Plan, American money rebuilding Europe, and yes, the Marshall Plan helped. $13 billion in aid made a difference. But here's what the Standard story often leaves out. The Marshall Plan was only about 20% of what West Germany invested in reconstruction. The other 80%? That came from Germans themselves, from savings, from labor, from determination, from millions of people working absurdly hard to rebuild what had been destroyed. And a huge portion of that labor came from women. Women who'd spent years passing bricks now worked in factories producing goods for export. Women who'd survived through black market trading now opened legitimate shops. Women who'd taught themselves to fix plumbing and wiring and masonry out of desperate necessity now found those skills were marketable. For the first time in German history, massive numbers of women entered the professional workforce not as temporary wartime replacements, but as permanent participants. They became nurses, teachers, secretaries, shopkeepers, factory workers, administrators. They earned money, they gained financial independence. This was revolutionary. Traditional German society had been deeply patriarchal. Women were supposed to focus on Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. But after years of running the entire society while men were gone, women had proven they could do anything men could do, and many of them had no interest in going back to the kitchen. Of course, many men, those who survived, those who came back from POW camps, had very different ideas. They wanted the old order restored. They wanted their jobs back. They wanted their authority back. They wanted women to return to subservient domestic roles. The tension between these competing visions would shape West German society for decades. Women had tasted independence. Many weren't willing to give it up, but German society wasn't ready to grant them full equality either, so they existed in a strange liminal space, working but paid less than men, independent but still legally subordinate in many ways, respected for their wartime resilience but expected to defer to male authority. It was progress. But it was incomplete progress. And it would take another generation, the daughters of the women who survived 1945, to push for real equality. By 1950, a pattern has emerged. Germany, West Germany specifically, has made an implicit collective decision. The decision is, we don't talk about certain things. We don't talk about what happened to women in 1945. We don't talk about the rape. We don't talk about the survival sex. We don't talk about the starvation. We don't talk about the collaboration. We don't talk about what people did during the war. We don't talk about the Holocaust, except in the most abstract terms. We don't ask questions about individual responsibility. We focus on rebuilding, on the future, on prosperity, on democracy, on being good members of the Western Alliance, on proving that Germans can be normal, trustworthy, civilized people again. This collective amnesia is enforced socially. If you try to talk about the past, people change the subject. If you try to discuss what you experienced, people get uncomfortable. If you try to seek justice for what was done to you, you're told to move on, to stop dwelling, to think about the children and their future instead of the past. For women who are raped, this silence is particularly toxic. Trauma doesn't just disappear because you refuse to acknowledge it. It festers, it manifests in other ways. Depression, anxiety, psychosomatic illness, relationship difficulties, inability to be intimate, rage that has no outlet. But they're told implicitly and explicitly that speaking about it would be selfish, would be dwelling on personal suffering when the nation needs to move forward, would be playing the victim when Germans, as the perpetrators of the Holocaust, have no right to claim victimhood. So they stay silent, they pack the trauma away, they pretend it didn't happen, they smile and cook dinner and raise their children and work their jobs and never, ever talk about the worst thing that ever happened to them. This silence will last for decades. It will only begin to break in the late 1990s and early 2000s when researchers finally start interviewing the few survivors willing to speak, when historians finally start treating German women's experiences as worthy of documentation. By then, most of the women who lived through 1945 are dead. They carried their stories to the grave, and with them went details, nuances, truths that we'll never recover. In 1949, Germany formally splits into two nations, the Federal Republic of Germany in the West, aligned with America and democracy and capitalism, the German Democratic Republic in the East, aligned with the Soviet Union and communism and central planning. For German women, this split means vastly different futures depending on which side of the line they end up. In West Germany, women slowly gain rights within a capitalist, democratic framework. They can work, but they're still legally subordinate to husbands. Until reforms in the 1970s, they can vote, but they're underrepresented in politics. They can own property, but they face discrimination in banking and business. It's progress, but slow progress. In East Germany, women gain formal equality much faster. The communist government, for ideological reasons, pushes for women in the workforce guaranteed childcare. Equal pay laws, women in government positions. On paper, East German women have more rights than their Western counterparts. In practice, it's more complicated. East German women do work in huge numbers. By the 1980s, over 90% of working-age women are employed, but they face the double burden, full-time work plus full responsibility for household labor. And they live in a surveillance state where speaking freely can get you imprisoned. Both systems are imperfect. Both systems reflect the broader tension between the ideals of gender equality and the reality of patriarchal social structures. But here's what's significant. In both Germanys, the women who survived 1945 and rebuilt the country are largely written out of the official narratives. West Germany emphasizes economic recovery through hard work and American aid. The role of women minimized, presented as supportive rather than central. East Germany emphasizes liberation by the Soviet Union and the triumph of socialism. The rape of German women by Soviet soldiers, never mentioned, literally erased from official history. Both nations need origin stories that serve their political purposes, and neither of those origin stories has room for the messy, complicated, morally ambiguous truth of what women actually experienced and did during and after the war. So the women who lived it watch as their history is rewritten, sanitized, packaged into neat narratives that bear little resemblance to reality, and most of them say nothing, because what can they say? Who would listen? The children born in the late 1940s and 1950s grow up in households filled with unspoken trauma. Their mothers won't talk about the war years. Their fathers, those who came back, won't talk either. There's just a vast silence where history should be. These children sense something is wrong. They feel the weight of secrets they don't understand. They see their mothers flinch at loud noises. They notice their fathers drink too much. They observe the tension, the depression, the emotional distance that their parents can't explain because they've never processed their own trauma. This is generational trauma in action. The parents survived impossible circumstances through repression and denial. They never got therapy. They never got to grieve properly. They never got to rage at the injustice of what happened to them. So all that unprocessed pain leaks out sideways, infecting their children. By the 1960s, these children are teenagers and young adults, and they start asking questions, difficult questions. What did you do during the war? How could you let this happen? Why didn't you resist? But this creates enormous conflict in German families. The younger generation wants accountability, wants honesty, wants their parents to admit to complicity, or at minimum, to acknowledge how terrible things were. The older generation, the women who passed bricks and starved and survived, they don't want to revisit it. They've spent 15 or 20 years building new lives, creating normalcy, pretending the past is past, and now their own children are demanding they rip open old wounds. Some families fracture completely. Children reject their parents' silence. Parents reject their children's judgment. The gap between generations becomes unbridgeable. Other families find ways to navigate it. Slowly, painfully, some stories start to emerge. Not the full truth, but fragments. Enough for the children to understand that their parents suffered too. that the moral universe of 1945 was more complicated than simple categories of good and evil allow. Gertrude is 71 years old. She's retired from teaching. She lives in a comfortable apartment in a rebuilt Munich that barely resembles the rubble field she once knew. She has grandchildren. She has a pension. She has security. She also has nightmares. Still, 30 years after the war ended, she dreams about passing bricks, about finding bodies in rubble, about the smell of decay that hung over the city in the summer of 1945, about watching Liesel's ribs become visible through her skin from starvation. She's never talked about any of this, not really. Anna and Liesel know some of it. They lived through it too, but they don't talk about it either. It's like a family pact. We survived. We moved on. We don't look back.
But Gertrude is old now, and old people start thinking about legacy, about what they'll leave behind, about what story will be told when they're gone.
One of her granddaughters is studying history at university. She asks Gertrude to tell her stories about the war, about what it was really like. And for the first time, Gertrude considers it. Actually talking, actually saying out loud the things she's kept locked inside for 3 decades. She starts small, little stories, funny ones mostly. The time they made coffee from acorns and it tasted so terrible they all gagged. The time Anna tried to flirt with an American soldier for chocolate and was so awkward he just gave her the chocolate out of pity. But the granddaughter wants more, wants the real stories, the hard ones. So Gertrude tells her about the one potato, about having to choose which daughter to feed more, about the mathematical calculations of survival that no mother should ever have to make, about the moral compromises and the desperate choices and the shame that still, even now, 30 years later, keeps her awake some nights. She cries while telling these stories. The granddaughter cries listening to them. And something shifts. Something heals just a little bit in the telling. This scene is happening in households across Germany in the 1970s and 80s. The survivors are aging, their grandchildren are asking questions, and slowly, tentatively, some of the silence begins to crack. Not all of it. Many women will die without ever speaking. But some do speak. And their testimony begins to build a more complete, more honest historical record. Gertrude won't live to see the full reckoning. She'll die in 1982, taking most of her stories with her. But the few she did tell, they matter. They're part of the historical record now, part of the truth that the next generation will inherit. The 50th anniversary of the war's end. Germany has been reunified for 5 years. The Cold War is over. A new generation of historians is asking new questions, and some of the last survivors are finally willing to talk. A researcher named Helke Sander makes a documentary called Liberators Take Liberties. It's about the mass rapes of 1945. It interviews survivors. It presents historical evidence. It breaks the silence that's lasted half a century. The reaction in Germany is explosive. Some people are grateful that finally someone is acknowledging what happened. Others are furious. They accuse Sander of creating a victim Olympics, of trying to equate German suffering with the Holocaust, of undermining Germany's moral reckoning with its Nazi past. The debate is fierce. It reveals how fraught the topic remains, how much unprocessed trauma still exists, how much resentment and pain and confusion surrounds this history. But the dam has broken. Once one person speaks publicly, others follow. More survivors come forward. More stories emerge. Academic studies begin, the historical record expands. And what emerges is complicated. the stories don't fit neat categories. Some women were victims, some were perpetrators, many were both, some resisted, some collaborated, most just tried to survive in impossible circumstances with no good options. This is when we start to get a fuller picture, when the sanitized narratives begin to give way to actual complexity, when we start to understand what really happened to German women after the war ended. Psychological studies in the 1990s and 2000s reveal the full cost of that silence, the cost of forcing millions of women to never speak about their trauma, to never process their grief, to never seek help for their pain. The studies show elevated rates of depression, anxiety, and PTSD among women who survived the immediate post-war period. They show patterns of emotional unavailability and difficulty with intimacy. They show substance abuse and psychosomatic illness, and a whole range of ways that unprocessed trauma manifests. And crucially, the studies show that this trauma passed to the next generation. The children of survivors show elevated rates of anxiety and depression, even if they never knew the details of what their mothers experienced. The trauma embedded itself in parenting styles, in emotional availability, in the very architecture of family relationships. This is the hidden cost of the conspiracy of silence. Trauma doesn't vanish when you refuse to acknowledge it. It goes underground. It finds other ways to express itself, and it cascades through generations. Some researchers estimate that the psychological impact of the war and immediate post-war period affected not just the survivors but their children and grandchildren, that there are Germans alive today who carry the emotional legacy of what happened in 1945, even though they weren't born until decades later. This is what war really costs, not just the immediate deaths and destruction, but the rippling psychological damage that echoes through time, through families, through entire societies. In 2003, Gabriele Kopp publishes a memoir called Why I Had to Wait So Long. She was 15 in 1945 when she was raped by Soviet soldiers. She waited 58 years to tell her story publicly. Why so long? Because for 58 years, German society wasn't ready to hear it, wasn't willing to acknowledge it, wasn't comfortable with the moral complexity it represented. But by 2003, things have changed enough that she can finally speak. And when she does, thousands of other women reach out, women now in their 70s and 80s, women who've never told anyone, women who've carried this burden alone for 60 years. They tell stories that are horrifying in their specificity. 14-year-olds raped repeatedly for days. Women who miscarried from the trauma. Women who contracted diseases. Women who were raped in front of their children or their parents. Women who tried to commit suicide and failed and were raped again. But they also tell stories of survival, of the strategies they developed, of the dark humor they used to cope, of the small kindnesses some soldiers showed, of the friendships with other women that got them through, of the determination to survive and rebuild and not let the trauma define them. These stories are important, not just as historical documentation, but as testimony to human resilience, to the capacity to survive even the worst circumstances, to rebuild even from total destruction. By the 2000s, the last Nazi war criminals are dying of old age. Women who worked as concentration camp guards are now in their 80s. A few are still being prosecuted. Most died without ever facing justice. In 2005, Erna Petri dies at age 92. She had been a Nazi guard. After the war, she disappeared into East Germany, took a new name, lived a quiet life. She was never prosecuted. She never expressed remorse. She went to her grave believing she'd done nothing wrong. There are hundreds like her, women who participated in atrocities and then vanished into post-war anonymity, who raised children and had grandchildren and lived normal lives while carrying the secret of what they'd done.
Some of them eventually confessed, usually near the end of life. The weight of the secret became unbearable, or they wanted to unburden themselves before dying, or they'd watched documentaries about the Holocaust and finally understood the magnitude of what they'd participated in.
These deathbed confessions are troubling. They raise questions about justice, about forgiveness, about whether there's any meaningful accountability when it comes 70 years after the crime. But they also serve a historical purpose. They prove that not all German women were victims. They complicate the narrative. They force us to acknowledge that women are capable of evil, that gender doesn't grant moral immunity.
So here we are, 80 years after the war ended. Almost everyone who lived through it is dead. We're left with recorded testimonies, documents, photographs, and a deeply complicated historical legacy. What do we do with it?
Some people argue we should emphasize German women's suffering, that 2 million rapes deserve acknowledgement, that the starvation and trauma and destruction were real and shouldn't be minimized. Others argue that emphasizing German suffering risks creating false equivalence with the Holocaust, that Germans were the perpetrators of history's greatest crime and shouldn't be allowed to claim victimhood. Both positions have merit, both are incomplete. The truth is that German women's experiences after World War II defy simple categorization. They were victims of sexual violence on a massive scale. They were also citizens of a nation that perpetrated genocide. Some of them actively supported that genocide, others resisted it. Most fell somewhere in the murky middle. They suffered enormously in the aftermath of the war. They also rebuilt their nation through extraordinary determination and labor. They carried trauma that still echoes through generations. They also benefited from the economic recovery and became part of one of the most prosperous societies on earth. All of these things are true simultaneously, and any honest accounting of this history has to hold all of these truths at once, even when they contradict each other, even when they make us uncomfortable. As of 2025, there are still a few survivors. Women who were children or teenagers in 1945. They're in their 90s now, the last living links to this history. Some of them are finally telling their stories, appearing in documentaries, writing memoirs, giving interviews, racing against time to get their testimony on record before it's too late. Others remain silent. They've kept their secrets for 80 years. They'll take them to the grave. And we'll never know what they experienced, what they knew, what they did. These last survivors are living bridges between past and present. When they die, and they're dying rapidly now, that bridge will be gone. The history will become purely archival, purely documentary. We'll lose the ability to ask follow-up questions, to hear the emotion in their voices, to see the pain or pride or regret in their eyes. This is why organizations are rushing to record oral histories, to preserve these testimonies while it's still possible, because soon, very soon, this history will have no living witnesses, and when that happens, the story becomes fixed, becomes whatever the historical record says it is. What will that story be? What should it be? That's the question we're still grappling with. So what really happened to German women after the war ended?
Everything. Everything happened. The best and worst of human nature playing out in the ruins of a collapsed civilization. Systematic rape on a scale that still shocks. Starvation that killed thousands even after the shooting stopped. Back-breaking labor to clear 400 million cubic meters of rubble. The silence of widows who waited decades for husbands who would never come home. The resilience of mothers who kept their children alive against impossible odds. But also complicity, collaboration, active participation in genocide, willful ignorance of atrocity, enthusiasm for a regime that murdered millions female guards who proved that evil isn't gendered.
And in between these extremes, millions of ordinary women trying to survive. Making choices, some heroic, some morally compromising, most just pragmatic, doing what they had to do to get through one more day. Being human in circumstances that seemed designed to strip away humanity. This is the story we need to tell. Not a story of saints or demons. Not a story that fits neatly into our preferred narratives about good and evil, but a story about complexity, about moral ambiguity, about the ways that humans navigate impossible situations. We need to acknowledge German women's suffering without erasing their complicity. We need to document the sexual violence without creating false equivalence with the Holocaust. We need to celebrate the women who resisted without ignoring the women who collaborated. We need to understand the trauma without excusing the crimes. This is hard, it's uncomfortable, it resists simple conclusions, but it's necessary because the story of German women after World War II isn't just a historical curiosity. It's a template for understanding how societies recover from total collapse, how humans rebuild after catastrophe, how trauma persists through generations, how silence compounds suffering, how moral reckoning happens or doesn't happen. These lessons are still relevant. We live in a world where wars still happen, where civilians still suffer, where societies still collapse and have to be rebuilt, where trauma still echoes through time, where moral complexity still confounds simple judgment. The German women of 1945 have something to teach us, not a simple lesson, not a comfortable moral, but something true about human nature, about survival, about the cost of war, about the long shadow of trauma, about the difficulty of justice, about the necessity of honest history. If we're willing to listen, if we're willing to sit with the discomfort, if we're willing to let go of our preferred narratives and embrace the messy, contradictory, profoundly human truth of what actually happened. That's what really happened to German women after the war ended, not what you think, not what the textbooks usually say, not what fits neatly into any ideological framework, just the complicated, painful, occasionally inspiring, often horrifying truth of human beings trying to survive and rebuild in the aftermath of total war. This is their story, finally being told 80 years later, imperfectly, incompletely, but honestly. And honesty, even when it's uncomfortable, is the only way we learn from history. The only way we honor the people who lived through it. The only way we avoid repeating it. 15 million women stood in the ruins in May of 1945. Some of them were victims, some of them were perpetrators, most were, both all of them were human. And all of them deserve to have their full, complicated, messy story told. Not the sanitized version, not the convenient version, the true version. That's what you've heard today, the truth. Or as close to it as we can get 80 years later, with most of the witnesses gone, with much of the evidence destroyed or suppressed, with history filtered through ideology and trauma and national mythology, but closer to truth than the story you probably knew before, closer to understanding what it was really like, what humans are really capable of, both the terrible and the transcendent. Remember Gertrude, remember her Christmas chicken, remember her standing in the ruins with a brick in her bleeding hands. Remember her making impossible choices about which daughter to feed. Remember her rebuilding a classroom in a broken building and teaching children to be better than their parents' generation. Remember that she was one of 15 million individual stories, 15 million unique experiences of suffering, survival, complicity, and resilience. We can't tell all those stories, most are lost forever. But we can tell enough to understand the shape of what happened, the scope of it, the meaning of it.
And maybe if we tell these stories honestly enough, we can learn something that helps us be better, helps us make better choices when faced with impossible circumstances, helps us recognize early warning signs of societal collapse, helps us understand how ordinary people become complicit in extraordinary evil, helps us see paths toward resistance, toward courage, toward choosing the hard right over the easy wrong.
Or maybe we won't learn anything. Maybe humans are doomed to repeat history, to make the same mistakes, to commit the same atrocities, to suffer the same catastrophes. But at least we'll know what happened. At least we'll have told the truth. At least the women who lived through 1945 and its aftermath will have their story recorded, preserved, remembered. Not as heroes, not as villains, but as humans. Complicated, flawed, resilient, terrible, inspiring humans who lived through hell and somehow, incredibly, built something new from the ruins.
That's what really happened to German women after the war ended.
Now,